Back to My Garden, Episode 3.
Welcome to Back to My Garden. Discover your passion for gardening. Here's Dave Ledoux.
Hi, it's Dave. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Are you on the list yet? What list? The VIP list. Shh. I set this up just for people listening to the podcast. Check out BackToMyGarden.com/VIP to see what I'm talking about. I got something special as a way of me saying thank you for supporting Back to My Garden. This episode of Back to My Garden brought to you by CoffeeRoyalty.com. Is it possible to lose 5, 10, even 20 pounds or more just by switching your coffee or tea? Check it out at www.CoffeeRoyalty.com. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world when you listen to this. I'm David Ledoux, and welcome to another edition of Back to My Garden. And today, we have a very, very special guest joining us from Minnesota. He is a horticultural fanatic. He's an author, speaker, garden blogger. He says he hates pulling weeds, but he loves fresh veggies. And he pioneered a unique solution using straw bale gardening. And he literally wrote the book on straw bale gardening. He's a blogger at strawbalegardens.com. I want to welcome to the show Mr. Joel Karsten. Joel, welcome to Back to My Garden.
Thank you, David. It's great to be with you. It's definitely true that when you grow vegetables, typical soil, you end up pulling lots of weeds. So that was the inspiration for trying to come up with some different method. That's for sure.
Fantastic. You know, Joel, I put you in a category of experienced gardener, but we have people listening to the show who are novices, beginners, all levels of experience. Can you just take a minute, and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
All right. Well, I'm a country boy. I was born and raised on a farm down in southwest Minnesota. And when you're a little kid growing up on a farm, you spend a lot of time baling hay, baling straw. Even a youth, 8 or 10 years old, I would see a broken straw bale laying up against the barn, and I would see halfway through the summer how weeds would start growing out of these bales, and kind of tuck that away in my memory bank. And then we fast forward about 15 years and I buy my first house. Like lots of people, I only had an inch of topsoil covering up this awful construction fill that they left behind. And my other problem was I had just graduated from college and I just bought a house, so I didn't have any money to build raised beds, which is what a normal vegetable gardener would do in that kind of situation. So what I ended up doing is using straw bales as a substrate, almost like a raised bed, and grew vegetables out of them. I did a whole bunch of experimenting and trials and testing to see what would work best, what method would work best. And over the past 21 years of doing it, I've sort of perfected the method and recruited a whole bunch of friends and colleagues and relatives and other people to write a book about this subject. So I did, and it's become a really good seller. So.
Fantastic. If you're having trouble, dear listener, visualizing what this looks like, you're going to head over to Joel's blog at www.strawbalegardens.com. Now, if you're driving in your car, stop by my blog at Back to My Garden, find Joel's podcast page. You got to go to his blog because I've never seen anything like it. It's truly brilliant. You have to see it, and I would imagine, Joel, that a lot of people are resistant to attempting what you have pioneered in the beginning. What kind of feedback do they give you after they've actually built one of these?
Well, that's very interesting that you say that, because I do get feedback from people, especially real experienced gardeners. A lot of times, they see you put straw bales in your backyard, and first they think your cheese slipped off your cracker a little bit. And then they come and knock on the door and they say, what are you going to do with those straw bales? Are you bringing horses or goats in your backyard, or what's going on? And then you say, no, I'm going to grow vegetables in those straw bales. And an experienced gardener will say, oh, well, that won't work, because you have to have soil in order to grow vegetables. You need the micronutrients that come from soil. And that's where the real fun begins, because if you become a straw bale gardener, you instantly become a teacher. And when you put those bales back there, you're going to get those questions, and then you're going to start teaching them how this process really works. And what happens, David, inside of those bales is the straw very quickly begins to decompose and compost. So within 2 weeks, by the time you're actually planting your vegetables into the bales, we've been conditioning the bales for 2 weeks. By the time you plant in there, the inside of that bale has really started to decompose and become brand new soil, become virgin soil. Now, anybody can understand that planting in brand new soil, virgin soil, has lots of advantages. There's no disease problems that previously existed in your soil. Soil will harbor diseases and insects for years and years. Also, there's no weed seeds. If you're starting with a nice clean bale of straw, there are no weed seeds in it. So as it decomposes, you have brand new, fresh, virgin soil without any other foreign seeds in it that are going to sprout. So it brings together the best of several worlds. And then once you explain it a little bit to even the experienced gardener, they say, oh, okay, I understand now. Now I get the concept. And then once you convince them to try it, then the game is over, because they'll be back next year. It always happens. They say, oh, last year I tried 5 bales, and well, this year we're doing 35 bales because it worked so well and it was so easy, and we decided to expand our straw bale garden. That always happens.
My goodness. You said something profound in terms of disease and contamination. I interviewed Annie Haven, who sells organic cow manure and compost, and she spoke about how in Southern California almost all their compost is polluted and has runoff and field sprays, and of course the cattle in the commercial farms, there's antibiotics and hormones. You don't have any of those problems in straw, do you?
Well, you get oat straw or wheat straw right off the field. Most farmers don't use a lot of chemical on oats and wheat these days just because it's a less valuable crop, and their weeds are so well controlled these days when they grow other crops that they really don't have to do much for weed control or insect control, because so many of the varieties are insect resistant today, that the straw comes off in pretty much organic condition. And now we're going to treat it. Now, you can do this completely organically by decomposing your bales using a nitrogen source like blood meal, which is what I recommend to folks. There are some other good sources out there. You could use feather meal, which is ground up poultry feathers. That works really well. It has lots of nitrogen in it. You could also use poultry manure, but it has to be poultry manure that's not too old, because when manure gets rained on for a long time, it tends to leach the nitrogen out of it, so it won't have a lot of nitrogen left. But if you use poultry manure that's about 6 to 12 weeks old, that's been covered during the composting period, it works terrifically because it'll have 6 to 7% nitrogen, and it really helps get these bales cooking during that conditioning period. So you can do it completely organically. You can use lawn fertilizer as well if you want to, and we give you the recipe for lawn fertilizer or doing it completely organically. And essentially all we're doing during this conditioning period, David, is we're feeding the bacteria that already exist inside the bales. And there's no roots in there yet, so the nitrogen we're giving is really just to feed the bacteria. And bacteria, as soon as you give them nitrogen and water, they begin to replicate and divide. And during this period of time while they're colonizing the bale, they vibrate. And that vibration causes the bales to warm up and heat up. So if you're in a northern climate, that's a really big advantage of straw bale gardening. Is when you begin the conditioning period, the bales get nice and warm. So now you're planting a tomato 2 weeks later into a bale that's 85 to 100 degrees instead of in the soil that's 45 or 50 degrees in that mid-May time period, at least in Minnesota where I live.
Yeah, I'm just slightly south latitude than you, but we had a killing frost last year, May 27th, and I could see where warmth in Canada, for example, is a major selling feature.
Yeah, I have a lot of people in the Arctic Circle that love this method of gardening. I get letters from them all the time. Our soil doesn't thaw out until mid-June, and it makes it so difficult. We have long days, of course, during the summer. So once the soil's warm, they get a great growing season. But their soil takes so long to thaw. So if they do this in straw bales, they get the big advantage of 3 to 4 weeks earlier planting, plus the fact that this bale is nice and warm. With those long days, they get just huge vegetables. This also works for people in Texas and in Florida, because they have a period of time during their growing season in what they would call winter, kind of a wimpy winter compared to our winter, but where it gets cool, and it frosted apparently 5 times in Houston this last year, and then the soil cools down. So now they have to wait until the soil warms up a little bit before their warm season crops like tomatoes will take off. And once their soil warms up, of course, then they can plant their tomatoes. What their hope is that they'll have ripe tomatoes before the heat sets in July. So an earlier jump start for them is a big advantage as well.
Joel, you've been doing this now for more than 2 decades. I want you to think of our timid, hesitant beginner gardener. Can you share an obstacle or maybe even a gardening disaster that you've overcome? And it can be humorous. Can you share something candid that you've done wrong in the past in gardening?
Well, in traditional gardening in the old days, it was, I, like everybody, you'd try gardening even back on the farm where when I would get my own plot, Grandma, of course, ran the big garden, Grandma and my mom and dad, but we would get our own little plot where you could plant, and it would just get taken over by weeds. By July 4th, if you weren't out there on a consistent basis every few days weeding, pretty soon everything was waist high and your garden just got mowed off because there was really nothing there that was going to be productive. But as far as straw bale gardening goes, I remember a couple of years ago I planted some cabbage. Of course, your instinct is to put cabbage in the top of the bales. And the cabbage were probably size of a softball or a large baseball at this point. And one of my water lines broke and it sort of carved out the bottom of the bale and the whole bale turned sideways. And when I came out a couple days later, here this bale had tipped over sideways and the cabbage was sticking out the side. So I thought, well, I think I'm just going to leave it because if I try to tip it upright, I'm going to mess up the bale. So I just left it grow. And these cabbage literally grew right out the side of the bale, flopped sideways. And they actually turned out better than some of my other cabbage because those big scoop leaves in the bottom that usually hold water, those were tipped sideways. So all the water ran out and there was less insect accumulation, et cetera, in those big heads of cabbage. By the time we were done, they were as big as a basketball. Just growing sideways right out the side of the bale. So that kind of inspired me. Now I plant all kinds of things right in the side of the bale. Broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage and all my herbs go on the sides of the bale. So not only do we put seeds in the top of the bale and other plants in the top of the bale, but we put bedding plants that come with a little bit of soil on them. We put those right in the side of the bale as well.
What kind of reaction? People must just give you looks.
Yeah, they at first they're kind of astounded, but then once they take a look and they see what we're doing, and you got to explain to them a little bit that, hey, by the time you plant, you're really not planting in straw per se. You're planting in compost inside of that straw bale, and that's beautifully productive soil. What is good soil? Well, good soil is decomposed organic material. At least a high percentage of it is, and that's what plants respond to, is those nutrients that come from the decomposing cells of previously live beings, plants or animals. As those cells decompose, they give off those nutrients that built those cells, and those nutrients don't disappear. They get reabsorbed by the next root that comes along and a plant that reabsorbs those nutrients. And Mother Nature does a great job of decomposing everything that's ever been alive on planet Earth, thankfully. And she does it using 5 main tools. Insects and worms, very common inside the straw bale. You'll see both of those. You also see lots of mold and fungi. And then what is present in large quantities, but you can't see them, are bacteria. And they're the helpful bacteria, the bacteria that are working on decomposition. Of course, they're microscopic, so you can't see them with the human eye, but you can feel them because that bale gets warm. And that's the bacteria that cause that warmth inside the bale, that vibration as they replicate themselves.
Absolutely brilliant stuff. My wife and I, Joel, are, crusading to get people to grow their own vegetables, even if it's just a lettuce, a radish, and a tomato, just because of the experience and what it brings to people's lives of being responsible for their own food source. How has your life changed because of your experience with gardening?
Oh, I think it definitely, lets you know where your food comes from. But I'm lucky because I've grown up with that. From when I was a young boy, we grew almost all of our produce, vegetables in our own garden at home. So it was only that period where I left home and went to college for a period of time before I owned my own house where I couldn't grow vegetables. And you really miss it. You really miss the fact, that you can't have fresh peas and the greatest things ever, fresh peas, fresh corn out of the garden, fresh green beans, all the things that you miss if you don't have your own garden, certainly. But, gardening, I completely agree with what you said earlier about everybody should grow something themselves. And I kind of have a little bit of a different take on it. My take is that if you talk to produce manager at a grocery store, what they're going to tell you is they get a shipment, great big bin of tomatoes in, and they put them out for display. And the consumer will pick through those tomatoes, and they will not take a tomato that has one tiny little blemish in the skin of that tomato. They'll leave it sit there. And then eventually that tomato either rots or they end up sending it back to their supplier, their distributor, who of course takes it back to the farmer and says, don't send me any more tomatoes with a blemish because I get them back and we don't want that. So now the farmer instructs his workers, when you're harvesting these tomatoes, if they have a blemish on them, those go in bin number 2, and the good ones are the ones we ship to the store. So they're sorting through and throwing out 40-50% of all the produce that they make because it has one tiny little blemish in the skin. Now, if somebody grows their own tomato at home and they spend all summer babying this tomato and taking care of it, and they pick that tomato and it has one little blemish, guess what they're going to do? They're going to take a knife and cut that out. They're going to eat the tomato. They're going to discover that they didn't die from eating that tomato. It wasn't the end of the world. And I think we can, at the root of it, we can change people's attitude towards produce in general, towards not having to have the absolute perfect apple or the absolute perfect piece of fruit. They'll eat it anyway. I'm not saying you should eat stuff that's moldy or spoiled or whatever by any means, but that won't happen in your garden anyway. But you might have something that's a little crooked or looks a little funny, still perfectly edible. And I think we can, at the root, we can change people's attitudes towards vegetables and towards what they eat, which in turn can change the whole consumer chain. Why is produce expensive? Well, because half of it doesn't get to the food chain. Half of it has to be filtered out because it's not perfect looking. It still tastes fine, but it doesn't look perfect. And I think we could change that.
That's huge. When you were telling that story, I was thinking, we started growing heirloom tomato seeds. 80, 90, 100-year-old varieties of tomatoes. And I thought, those pioneers were skinny because some of these plants had 2 fruits on them and they were little grotesque things and kind of
But brilliant. They sure taste good.
Oh,
they sure taste good.
Coming from living in the city where a store-bought tomato and then you grow your own and you realize you haven't eaten a tomato until you've eaten your own tomatoes.
I have a short little diatribe in my book. I don't know if you've read that section, but where I talk about if you grow anything in a straw bale garden, you should try growing some heirloom tomatoes. Because number one, tomatoes are very disease sensitive. And the disease, fungal disease, septoria and verticillium is harbored in the soil. So if you haven't had success, it's probably because you have fungal disease in your soil. But with introducing straw bales, you're never going to touch the soil because you have that separation layer. So you can do a great job of growing heirloom tomatoes without, ever touching the soil. And they're going to tend to perform much better. And I tell people, if you've never had an heirloom tomato, if you've never tasted one, it's probably because you've never grown one. Because people who grow heirlooms don't give them away. And people who grow heirloom tomatoes can't really functionally sell them because if you put a bunch of heirlooms in a box and try to carry them to the farmer's market, by the time you get there, they've rolled around a little bit and the skins have cracked open and nobody wants to buy them. They have very thin skins, many varieties of them, which makes them much more palatable. And the thin skin makes them taste better. But they're not easy to sell. You can't carry them around and ship them and that kind of thing. They have to be harvested, and within 2 or 3 days they have to be eaten. And you can't really do that very well unless you grow them yourself.
I want to talk about your book, Joel, because a lot of people listening to this podcast, even though they're new, some of them are very adventurous and they want to try a new style of gardening. And they just don't, how do you start a straw bale garden? Can you just touch on how your book can help the person with a vision to start their own straw bale garden?
I always tell people that this is the perfect way to garden for those who are just beginning gardening and those who might be towards the end of their career in gardening, because gardening, lifting soil, it's heavy, 40 to 60 pounds per cubic foot. So as you get older and you can't get down on the ground, it's much easier if you can plant 20 inches above the ground in the top of a straw bale, and you can harvest there as well. Now, for the newbie gardener, I always jokingly say that we should force people to garden in the soil for a couple of years before we let them garden in straw bales, because they would see how much easier it is. If you let them start out with straw bales, it just seems so easy. Why doesn't everybody grow a garden? Because it really is that much easier. First step is they got to find straw bales. So look around. If worse comes to worse, you can always use a hay bale. If you get further south down into Florida and places like that, there are a lot of people down there that don't have access to straw. There's no oats or wheat or barley, cereal grains or small grains grown in their area. But if you get above the Mason-Dixon line, look around a little bit, you can find some straw bales. There's lots of oats and wheat grown all over this country. So get your hands on a couple straw bales, and you're going to spend the first 10 days conditioning the bales, getting them ready. You're going to put fertilizer, water on them. It can be organic fertilizer. It can be regular lawn fertilizer. And we go through in the book, and we spec exactly what to look for and how much to put on, how to put it on, all the details. But essentially put some fertilizer and water. That fires up the bacteria. The bacteria start to consume the inside of that straw bale. And after 10 days, you'll see the heat inside that bale gets really warm, get up sometimes 140, 150 degrees. Then it cools off a little bit. As soon as it gets under 105, it's planting day. You can use bedding plants. So they come with some soil on the roots, already started plants. And you can start your own seeds, of course, indoors if you're in a cooler climate. And you can use those to plant right into the bale, make a hole in the bale and shove it right down into that decomposing straw, which will not look like soil when you plant. Trust me, it will still look like you're planting into a straw bale, but it's the microscopic bacteria inside there that have started to decompose that straw and have reversed that nitrogen sink and are now supplying nitrogen. Believe me, the plants will love that environment. As soon as it's cooled off a little bit in there, it's ready to plant. Now, if you're doing seeds, you have to make a seed bed on top of the straw bale. Now, what I don't want you to do is take your shovel and go over to your garden and take a scoop of soil and put on top of the straw bale, because now you just brought weed seeds with you. You just brought disease and insect problems. So we want to avoid that. What we want to get is one bag of sterile planting mix at the garden center. Put a thin little 1-inch layer, like you're frosting a cake, on top of that bale. And now put your peas and beans and carrots and whatever you're going to plant from seed in that seed bed. And it'll hold that seed, moisture around that seed for 10 days or so until that seed germinates and sends a root down into the bale, and now you've got a well-established seed bed at that point. So it's pretty simple. It's as simple as that. Now, the big advantage is you're going to probably water a little bit less than you would a traditional garden. Straw tends to hold moisture really well. And you're not going to have the weeds that you have from a traditional garden. You're not going to need to do as much fertilization. Some of your fertilization comes from that conditioning process, but a lot of it comes from the decomposing straw. That bacteria breaks the straw down, and all the nutrients that it took to grow the wheat and the oats are now available for this new plant to reabsorb. So that, it's raised up off the ground. Not everybody has knee or back or leg problems and can't get down on the ground, but if you do, this is a great way for them to be able to garden. I have lots of people who garden out of their wheelchair. If they use a chair to get around, this is a great way for them to be able to have a garden without all the expense and commitment of building raised beds, which can be very expensive. And, if you're a renter, the option of having a raised bed is pretty much out. If you own your own house, that's different. But for a lot of people, this gives them flexibility. And I have people that do this in a parking lot. You don't have to have soil at all. You can do this on concrete. You can do this on the roof of your building. Wherever you can get a straw bale, carry it up there, put down your straw bale. If you have water and you have sunlight and you have a straw bale, you can have a beautiful vegetable garden.
I don't know if I couldn't take notes fast enough. That was just, every 10 seconds, somebody turns 60 in North America.
Yeah.
And so your system is brilliant. When you said parking lot, the future, look at California. They haven't had rain this year in some parts. Anything to do with conservation of water, growing their own food. Wow. This is very good stuff. Your book, the best place to get it is on your blog, right?
Yeah.
StrawBaleGardens.com.
Yep.
If you have a loved one who's a gardener, this is now the book to give them for Christmas. I'm going to get one for my wife. That's fantastic. Now, you've been doing this 2 decades. I'm sure your gardens have changed constantly in that time. What does your garden look like today?
I'd love to show you a picture. It's right out the back window right behind me. But unfortunately, I tried earlier with my webcam, and it's too bright outside, so it doesn't show up very well. I've got 25 bales going this year. Most of it is vegetables. I've got a few bales that I grow for cut flowers because it's a great way to grow summer bulbs. In cold climates like Minnesota, we have to dig a hole and plant our bulb in the spring, and then we have to dig it up in the fall and store it inside over the winter. And a straw bale makes it really easy. I condition the bale. I shove 100 gladiolus bulbs down in a bale. They all bloom. They make beautiful blooms. I cut those, and I use them for display in the house. Big bouquets of flowers throughout the summer. I do gladiolus, caladiums, calla lilies, dahlias, all the list of summer bulbs that I use strictly for cut flowers. And then I also do all kinds of vegetables. Of course, obviously, all your tomatoes. I think I have 15 tomatoes this year, and peppers, multiple varieties of peppers, all kinds of herbs, your parsley, chives, oregano, tons of basil, purple basil, Thai basil, regular basil, all different kinds of basil because we're big basil people. Interestingly, this year I'm growing a few sunflowers for cut flowers. I always grow zinnias and other things for cut flowers, but I planted a few sunflowers this year just to get some little ornamental ones to use as cut flowers as well. But just a whole mix of stuff. Above every row of bales, so I usually put 5 bales in a row, and then above every row of bales, I put a fence post at each end of the row, and then I run wires back and forth between those fence posts. So it creates like a little espalier or a little trellis above the bales. And that allows all the peas and beans and my cucumbers. I hang those cucumber vines up on top of those espalier wires. So now when you pick your cucumbers, you can stand up and walk down the row and pick those cucumbers instead of having to bend over on the ground. They stay nice and clean this way. They don't get dirt splash on them. And for vine crops that are disease sensitive, again, it's those fungal spores harbored in the soil. So if we can get those vines up off the ground, we avoid any of that fungal problem on our vine crops. Some of the big ones, pumpkins and watermelon and your big varieties of squash, butternut, those have to be on the ground. But I like to put a layer of either straw or wood chips down and then let the vines run on top of those. It tends to keep them separated a little bit from the fungal spores in the soil, and they do a lot better that way. But it's not a big area. I have 25 bales, and my space is probably 20 feet deep and about 35 or 40 feet wide. So it's not a huge area. It doesn't take any more area to grow the same amount of vegetables in straw bales as it does in the soil. So if you have the same garden space, you can get just as much or more production out of the straw bales.
I'm going to do a shout out to Winston in Glasgow, Scotland, and his biggest complaint is he doesn't have enough space. Winston, I know you guys use meters up there, but think your space is bigger than Joel's, and Joel has. You heard it. You can do this, Winston. Joel, a lot of people are resistant to gardening. A lot of excuses like no time or too busy. I want to ask you. Is there anything you've never grown that you'd love to experiment with?
I've grown about everything, that is possible to grow at this latitude. There's a few things that we've discovered just don't seem to do very well. One of those is sweet corn. It grows fine, but it's lanky and tall. It tips over real easy. It's hard to keep it upright. Other crops like asparagus and rhubarb, they take 3 years really to get a root established before you can harvest anyway. And in 3 years, David, there's going to be nothing left but a little lump of soil in your garden. That's all that will be left. So I don't recommend growing things that are perennial roots that come back from the same root year after year. I guess as far as things I haven't experimented, there's a bunch of ornamentals, flowers and other things like that, that I haven't done. People ask me all the time, can you plant shrubs? Where you're going to leave the bale there, bury part of the bale, and then plant shrubs in it. I've never done that, but there's no reason why it wouldn't work. I'd like to experiment with that a little bit and see how that works. I can't think of anything else. I've grown, up here, this far north, it's pretty tough to grow things like sweet potatoes, but I have very good success with sweet potatoes. Peanuts can be difficult, and we do peanuts in our straw bales. I tell folks when I teach classes up here that gardening in straw bales this far north is kind of like gardening 400 miles south. It's like gardening for me in northern Missouri or mid-Missouri because of the season extension you get, because you can plant quite a bit earlier. And when you plant earlier, your tomatoes will be ripe 2 to 3 weeks earlier than all of your neighbors. And I always tell people, if you're the first one with ripe tomatoes, that means you've won.
Fantastic. Oh, Joel, man, we could go for hours, but the time is getting away from us. It's time to play my favorite part of the show. It's called 5 Quick Questions. Are you ready to play?
Sure.
All right, question number 1. Why do you think, or what do you think is the number one reason people don't try straw bale gardening?
I get resistance, especially from people overseas, that they can't find straw bales. And that's a difficulty. But a little inside information for you. The next book, we're going to solve that problem.
Oh, brilliant. Ooh, a cliffhanger. When's the next book coming out?
The next book will be spring of 15, sometime spring of 15, just an expanded version of this book. But we are going to do some stuff in there where I've been doing a bunch of experimenting, and we're going to show you some alternatives to buying a straw bale, some things you can create on your own that people will be very interested to read about. So
all right.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Question number 2. What is the best gardening advice you ever received?
The best gardening advice, this is going to sound really strange, but my grandma Josephine was my first professor of horticulture. And every time before we'd go to the garden, she had a bar of soap laying by the front door. She'd pick up the bar of soap, she'd scratch it with her fingernails. And when you get to the garden, you garden all day long. You go to wash your hands at the end of the day. She didn't wear any garden gloves. She'd wash her hands, and guess what? That soap under her nails would dissolve, and she never had dirt under her fingernails that way. So all your gardeners can use that. Keep a bar of soap by your door. When you're leaving to go out and garden, just pick it up and scratch it a little bit, and you won't have dirty fingernails ever.
That's gold. Good. Number 3. If you had just 2 websites to share with a beginner gardener, what would they be?
Oh, there's a lot of great blogs out there these days. Garden Rant is a great one. In the Garden. Oh, there's a ton of them. Off the top of my head, I can't narrow it down to just a couple. But they could always go to ours. I mean, ours is a good website for a beginner and read some of the posts on there. We have a Facebook page with 42,000 gardeners from all over the world that they absolutely, and they come on and they talk about good things and they talk about their issues. If they have problems that they run into, they talk about those. So it's a great place to learn. It's called Learn to Grow a Straw Bale Garden on Facebook. So that's another great place.
Fantastic. Oh, that's a good one. Number 4. What's the best gardening book or resource you can suggest?
I have a book. I don't know if it's the best for this method of gardening, but just an overall book. It reminded me a lot of my grandma when I read it. It was called The No Work Garden Book by Ruth Stout. One of my all-time favorite books. She talks in the book just like you're sitting across the table talking to your grandmother. I mean, just a sweet lady. You can just tell by her voice that comes through in the book. And she talked about her method of gardening that she developed years ago. A lot of very interesting stuff in there and really inspiring. And again, if you have a grandma, and at the time when I read it, my grandma wasn't around anymore. So it was kind of like this weird feeling like you're talking to your grandma through this book. It was a very interesting book. And I actually bought a first edition of that book. It's probably one of my most treasured possessions. It's the No Work Garden Book by Ruth Stout. First edition, I believe it's mid-60s sometime, something like that.
Brilliant. Nice. And number 5. What's the number one thing that every gardener should try to grow next year?
Tomatoes. Without a doubt. If you haven't grown tomatoes, you have to grow your own tomatoes. A few varieties. You will be successful. I guarantee you. If you do this in straw bales, there is no way you'll fail. Now, your level of success may vary depending on how much effort you put in, but if you put any effort at all, you're going to get tomatoes by, either the earliest on your block or one of the earliest batches of tomatoes on your block. And people love the early tomatoes. Nobody wants your tomatoes in September. I always tell people, you're driving around the neighborhood looking for unlocked car doors so you can throw in bags of tomatoes in September. Everybody's trying to get rid of them. It's the first tomatoes that really count. And as a straw bale gardener, you'll be the first one with ripe tomatoes.
Well, dear listener, another podcast has come and gone, but this one's been a doozy. I want everybody to head over to Joel's blog at strawbalegardens.com. I want you to pick up a copy of his book. I want you to join the conversation. You want to talk about passionate people, head over to his Facebook group, and that's at Learn to Grow a Straw Bale Garden. Learn to grow a straw bale garden. I bet you if you just search straw bale garden, it'll come up on Facebook, but there's 42,000 people talking about it. I'm going to give the last word to you, Joel. If you could just share a thought of wisdom or encouragement for our listeners today in their gardening journey. Go ahead.
You don't have to start with 50 bales like I did. Start with 1 or 2 bales and resist the criticism, because you're going to get neighbors and friends and relatives that think you're off your rocker and this isn't going to work and blah, blah, blah. But you got to forge ahead. Just keep forging ahead and invite them over on the day when you harvest your potatoes. And you cut those bales open and you give it a little shove and the bale falls over and out comes 3/4 of a bushel of potatoes out of that straw bale. And that will change their mind forever from that day forward. Everybody should grow their own food, at least something that they eat, because it inspires you. It will inspire your kids if you have kids. I have people from literally in their 90s that are doing this, all the way down to a little kid for a 4-H project. He's 8 years old, and he's growing his own straw bale garden. So it doesn't matter how old you are, how much experience you have, what physical condition you're in, you can do this. So give it a try. Get your hands on a straw bale. If you find some this fall, just set them out in your garden so you can use them next spring. Don't put them in your garage, because you'll make a mouse hotel. Put them outside in your garden. They'll get wet, and the mice don't like them at all once they're wet. So keep them in the rain and the snow over winter. Next spring, they'll be ready to go.
Absolutely brilliant. Joel, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, David, for having me. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed being with you. Have a great day.